In this lecture, I'll briefly describe the top 5 cognitive biases impacting communication and negotiation. The first bias I'd like to mention is the agreement bias. So this is just the tendency to want to reach agreement at the table. It's really important to ask yourself whether the deal in front of you is actually a good deal and whether it's better than your no deal option. And if it is better than your no deal option, you need to be prepared to walk away. That's a very important bias, and it's one to keep in mind when you're planning in advance for a negotiation. Another cognitive bias is something called anchoring. Now, anchoring is a cognitive bias that exists all over human cognition. And it's our tendency to be influenced by numbers that don't really matter. So, in one study, for example, they asked people to try to guess or remember the number of countries in Africa. And before they did that, they rolled a random number generator, showed that person a random number. And what they found was that if the random number was very high, they gave a high guess for the number of countries in Africa. If the random number was very low, they gave a low guess for the number of countries in Africa. This is obviously a cognitive bias because there's no rational reason that a random number should influence your belief about how many countries there are in Africa. This also emerges quite commonly in negotiation. There was another study that looked at mechanics assessing the price of a car. Now, mechanics are experts. They should be guided both only by their own intuitions, but they responded to suggestions from outside. If someone gave a high number, that mechanic gave a high estimate. If someone gave a low number, that mechanic gave a low estimate. And it happens at the negotiation table as well. We'll talk more about this later. In fact, I'll show you some evidence from our own negotiation exercises. But whatever the first offer that's put at the table is, that pretty heavily predicts the actual final outcome. And that is the cognitive bias of anchoring. Another important cognitive bias is naive realism. So naive realism is the belief or the tendency to believe that we are really seeing what's true. So this came out in a study, a sort of lighthearted example, a pretty old example was from a football game between Princeton and Dartmouth, two rivals in the United States. And what they did was they took a video recording of this football game. They showed it to Princeton fans, they showed it to Dartmouth fans, and they asked them to count how many fouls were there, against your team or against the other team. And as you can imagine, Dartmouth fans counted a larger number of fouls against their own team, and Princeton fans counted a larger number of fouls against their own team, even though they were looking at the exact same video. So people's preferences, their in-group biases were shifting their belief about their objective perception. This can take a darker turn as well. In a similar study, researchers took a video of a protest, a political protest, and they showed it to conservative Americans or liberal Americans. And they told people either that the video was of a protest that favored a conservative cause. So in this case, it would have been a pro-life or anti-abortion protest, or they told people that the protest was something that favored a liberal cause. So in this case, they told them that it was a marriage legalization or gay marriage protest in favor of a marriage legalization. And as you can imagine, or rather, then they asked people to evaluate how violent are the protesters. And as you can imagine, the conservative protesters or the conservative viewers rated the protest as very violent when it was pro-gay marriage and very peaceful when it was pro-life or anti-abortion. In contrast, the liberal commentators rated the protest as very violent when it was for a conservative cause, so pro-life or anti-abortion, and they rated it as very peaceful when it was for their own cause, so pro-gay rights or marriage legalization. And this is called naive realism because everybody believes they're being objective. They're looking at video evidence, but the way in which the video evidence is described turns out to have a huge impact on how people are perceiving that evidence. And yet, if you ask people, everybody's going to say, of course, they're looking at it objectively. That is naive realism. So a similar type of bias is something called the egocentric bias of fairness. So the egocentric bias of fairness is the tendency to think that we're being fair when nobody else is. So this was tested with a newspaper survey from, I think, USA Today, that asked people, they gave people a list of celebrities and said, what's the likelihood that this celebrity is going to heaven? You know, Mother Teresa, I think was in there, some famous actors, and then they also asked people to rate the likelihood that they would go to heaven. And on average, people rated themselves as more likely to go to heaven than even Mother Teresa. So everybody thinks Mother Teresa is great, but apparently we think our own selves are even better. Now, this is very important in negotiation and communication because fairness can mean things not only like resource allocation in terms of fairness of the deal, but also fairness at the table. So you may have an argument where everybody thinks the other person is dominating the conversation. It may turn out that they're actually both talking the same amount, but this egocentric bias of fairness combined maybe with that tendency towards naive realism means that everybody thinks that they're getting the short end of the stick. Okay, the final bias I'd like to talk about is the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to attribute people's behavior to their core personality rather than circumstance. So, for example, if a person is late turning something in, you might say, oh, that's the kind of person who's always late. But in fact, maybe they had a really bad day or they hit some traffic on the way. And this is particularly important in negotiation when we're reading people's styles, when we're reading the way they're approaching the conversation or the kind of circumstances that they're constrained by as they come up with deals. It's really important to consider the context they might be facing and not just assume everything is a core element of their personality. So these are 5 of the most common cognitive biases that impact communication and negotiation. We'll be talking about even more cognitive biases in a later lecture, and that concludes this lecture on the 5 cognitive biases impacting communication.